Mr. President, dear Paul, Stefan, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sure also that I can say dear friends, although friends in politics is always a tricky word. This is my first speech as President of the EPC, and I consider it an honor to have been asked to assume this role. This inauguration also marks the move of the EPC earlier this year from the premises in the Residence Palace to the new ones in the 1416 Rue du Trône, Troonstraat, which includes the custom-built conference center we are in at the moment. I'm also officially naming the Max Koonstam room next door, which pays tribute to one of the founding fathers of the EPC, who was one of the key personalities instrumental in the creation of the European Union. And despite being interned during the Second World War, he was one of the key figures involved in the Schuman Plan, pushing for reconciliation and for cooperation. His commitment to the European integration, despite his personal experiences, should serve as an example to us in today's uncertain world. We have enough reasons to be happy, to celebrate and to welcome the new working year. Certainly we had a marvelous summer almost all over Europe, and the autumn can be a beautiful season, especially for a haiku poet. Hopefully not only for this rare species of poets, but actually it was a very bad summer. It was a very bad summer for humanity and the European cause. And it could be that autumn will not be any better. The Greek crisis lasted too long. Polarization grew dangerously, and both creditors and Greece reached an agreement not perceived as a traditional win-win compromise by anybody. The mix of responsibility and solidarity was only obtained at the very last minute, and both virtues were accepted reluctantly. And only because of the alternative, and the alternative was the abyss for Greece and its people. A Grexit would have been the worst option for the Eurozone. Avoiding the worst is sometimes another way of doing the right thing. But all are convinced that this third bailout is the last one. The future of Greece depends on the successful implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding. And let's hope that the new Greek government that will emerge after the elections will be stable and determined. Optimism is a moral duty. Even at the height of the crisis, the Eurozone and the common currency show their robustness. During those 5 months, Greece is a unique case, very different from all the other countries which were under program or under pressure. But this robustness should not weaken our will to deepen economic and monetary union. Europe has the habit to take action and to make qualitative jumps when with the back against the wall. Hesitating and waiting creates a cost in terms of growth and jobs. And we should avoid this. The proposed implementation calendar of the 5 presidents' reports, as a follow-up to my 4 presidents' report, shows no urgency and is, I fear, not being taken seriously enough. We have to take urgent steps toward a capital market union, a commitment for structural reform by all member states, and later on, a real fiscal capacity. On top of more responsibility and more solidarity, we will also need more shared sovereignty. Personally, I would not create new institutions and new posts. We already have enough players. Some are thinking that you solve a problem by creating new jobs, trying to avoid working on the fundamentals. We need more competitiveness, a real energy single market, the digital economy, innovation. We need more social cohesion and more jobs. The ongoing economic recovery and the shift in the political agenda towards migration shouldn't prevent us from working on a genuine economic and monetary union. Otherwise, we will fall in the trap of short-termism, the disease of modern politics. Migration became the top priority this summer, but it has been at the hard core of populism and extremism for more than 20 years. So it's not a new problem, but there was, until recently, not sufficient sense of urgency. Even the human tragedies in the Mediterranean over the last years were apparently not sufficient to mobilize enough political energy to tackle the challenge. That is shameful. The massive inflow of refugees over the last months changed the dimension of the challenge, as well as altering perceptions dramatically. To a large extent, it is the result of the wars in Syria, Iraq and Libya. And history will judge who is responsible for the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, which could have been avoided. The UN Security Council was and is powerless. Let us hope that after the nuclear deal on Iran, the so-called big powers can find a solution for Syria and decide to combat barbarism together. The division in the Arab world also contributes heavily to overall instability. They need a Westphalian peace agreement, as was reached in Europe after the terrible 30 Years' War. The Westphalian peace treatment dates from 1648. These are the root causes of the problem. As long as the war lasts, people will flee to Europe, their northern neighbor. And more than ever, we need a common foreign and defense policy, which is more than providing humanitarian aid to refugees in the camps in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, where 4 million people are living. It's in our interest. These large displacements of population around Syria, more than just migration, and its ramification in Europe are felt in some countries as a threat to the stability of their societies. It shouldn't provoke a shift in our political landscape to the extremes, threatening the Union as such. But the current situation strengthens the feeling of powerlessness of the political world. And that's why it's so important not to mix up problems and solutions and to stay moderate in the political rhetoric. Words can be as important as deeds in these days. We have different phenomena. The war refugees who cannot return to a so-called safe country. The free movement of EU citizens, which are not migrants. Economic refugees, for instance from the Balkan countries and some African countries. And finally, the fight against terrorism. And we also shouldn't mix up free movement, the Schengen zone and the Dublin regulation. Some want to get rid of all three of them. They want a return to national borders, not only a fragmentation of the Union, but a dislocation or a falling apart of the European Union. We have to act to preserve the acquis. This can only result in more common policies on asylum and migration, not less. A fair distribution of refugees is inevitable, as the Commission rightly proposed in June and yesterday. More than 300,000 people entered our continent in the first 8 months of this year. The problem is qualitatively different compared to June. I hope that we can also overcome this crisis. Unfortunately, we often need a crisis in order to agree. But in this case, the lives of human beings are at stake. If ministers fail to agree next week, it will have to become Chefsache. In the end, we are a union based on values. Violating these rules, they were based on rules. Violating these rules is dangerous. Even if we are aware of the fact that some of those regulations are conceived for normal times, with other levels of migration, and that they thus need to be complemented with new provisions. Even more, we are a union of values. We have open, pluralistic societies, already now culturally heterogeneous. We shouldn't have any nostalgia to the world of yesterday, die Welt von gestern. Our values make our union unique: political democracy, the rule of law, non-discrimination, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. There is no place for doubts on this acquis. And looking at the images and the pictures of refugees, dead or alive, people who had until a few years ago a normal life, one wonders in what a surrealistic world we are living, on our own soil, under our watch, far from our well-organized, streamlined daily living. Others are disturbing our egocentric world. The faces of refugees constitute an ethical appeal of the first degree. And a lot of European citizens showed recently that they are not insensitive to this desperate plea. These desperate war refugees will continue to try, via land or by crossing the sea, to come to Europe. No fences, no national border controls, nor lower social benefits will discourage them to move. Only peace can stop war refugees. Free movement of the EU citizens is different from these flows of refugees or from economic migration. Overall, it has a positive economic impact, and clearly, abuse has to be eliminated by national and European legislation. But in the end, free movement is one of the great achievements of the European Union. Economic migration poses different challenges. Africa will have 2 billion inhabitants in 2060 and 4 billion by the end of this century. GDP growth per capita is very uneven, but with a growth of 2% on average, the gap with our living standards will remain attractive. We need a comprehensive policy vis-à-vis Africa and in cooperation with the Africans. We have to face these new realities. Migration is part of human history. In some way, we are all the descendants of migrants. Many of our parents and grandparents, my mother and my grandmother, were war refugees in last World War, and some of them even in 2 world wars. We tend to forget this in a postmodern society. We have to act in order to preserve the basic values and foundations of our union and the stability of our societies. I hope that there is not a deficit of leadership. It can be as harmful as a democratic deficit. I also hope that migration and the confusion around this theme will not be misused in the campaign on UK membership of the Union. The rational arguments, especially the economic and historical piece, the arguments, economic and historical ones, are very strong. But the emotional discourse can take the upper hand. Migration would then divide our union dramatically, even if Britain is not a member of the Eurozone or of Schengen. Keeping the union together has to be a top priority for the upcoming months. A standalone nation is not a solution for any problem. For terrorism, migration, climate change, or economic growth. A standalone makes a country irrelevant in the global economy and on the world stage. Brexit would threaten the very existence of the UK and encourage separatists elsewhere in Europe. I'm still convinced that reason will prevail at the end, but we have to support reason through negotiating a positive outcome. We shouldn't forget the economy. It's the economy, stupid. It's true. But it is not the whole political truth. In the 90s, populist and extremist parties were quite strong in Western Europe in the midst of rather strong economic growth. But the economic agenda remains important. Quantitative easing of the ECB and its impact on the exchange rate of the euro, the announcement of the Juncker investment plan, structural reforms, fiscal flexibility, and the free fall of oil prices were helpful and are delivering results. But regaining competitiveness on world markets is still a major challenge. And secular stagnation is a critical threat. In an aging society, we tend to save too much, but invest and innovate too little, even in our strongest economies. And the fact that the BRICS countries are in trouble shouldn't make us complacent. It simply shows that there are no economic models, no economic miracles. At the end of the day, it is the real economy that counts, not artificial credit-fueled growth. Focusing on the real economy must also be about respecting the Sustainable Development Goals, but quite a number of our member states are lagging behind in the implementation of these goals. We have to make the EU economy more sustainable by promoting policies such as the development of the circular economy. And we also have to address climate change. And the COP21 climate conference in Paris is prepared by the EU. Our climate package decided by the European Council in October 2014, my last European Council, is prepared by China and by the USA. One can feel that there is a political will to make progress, even if we need a lot more to reach the 2-degree ceiling for global warming. Ladies and gentlemen, a think tank like the EPC must contribute to solutions. It can advise, warn, and encourage, always in the spirit of taking the European project forward. We are not living in times of a new grand design, but in times where we have to salvage the fundamentals of our union. We fought and are still fighting to maintain the Eurozone, to keep our club of nations together, to preserve the rights of EU citizens, to maintain the social and societal coherence of our societies. We can only succeed if we transcend defensive behavior and dare to take new paths of more responsibility, more solidarity, and more shared sovereignty. A key word in our new Pact for Europe is fragmentation. Our societies inside each country are fragmented due to fear, inequalities, unemployment, and our union itself is too fragmented, even our common market, because it takes courage and leadership to go beyond national and corporatist interests. As I said, fragmentation is manageable. Dislocation, the EU falling apart, isn't. A think tank has the responsibility to speak. Speaking for Europe is our motto, and that's what the EPC will continue to do. In office, I very much appreciated the work of the EPC. I was almost a daily reader of its publications, so you have a reader. I'm confident that the EPC will continue to deliver its mission to foster European integration through analysis and debate. I'm looking forward to being involved in this important endeavor in the coming years. Let me end with something that is highly original. I will end with a haiku. A tank full of thoughts, always striving for Europe. Worry and hope A haiku you have to read it twice because it's so short. A tank full of thoughts, always striving for Europe, worry and hope. Thank you.